Okay, this recorded video lecture is for my Anatomy and Physiology 1 students. And what we're going to cover on this one are membranes. So we're going to start with membranes. So what makes up a membrane? A membrane is made up of epithelial tissue on top of or adjacent to connective tissue. So we have two different types of tissue that come together and give us a membrane. Now there's various membranes in the body, but there are four classes of membranes that we're going to go over. Now for my lecture videos, I don't edit these kind of like in class. I really don't know how to edit them. So you're getting it sort of kind of like in real time, what you're used to. All right, so one type of membrane. Cutaneous. So the cutaneous membrane. The cutaneous membrane is a dry membrane. And as it turns out, our cutaneous membrane is our skin. And our skin is covered in great detail in the integumentary system. So we will cover that on the integumentary system. All right, another membrane is the mucous membrane. An older term, we called it the mucosa. Now, this one is a wet membrane. A wet membrane. Okay, where do we find the mucous membrane? It lines body cavities that open to the exterior. So lines body cavities that open to the exterior. Let's think about that. Let's think about that for a minute. What kind of body cavities open to the exterior? Well, one is the digestive. We think of the digestive tract, right, that opens to the exterior. The mouth, right, the anus, the opening, okay, respiratory, reproductive, and urinary. So all of these systems have body cavities that open up to the exterior, and they are all lined in a mucous membrane. So remember, we said all membranes have epithelial tissue adjacent to connective tissue. Kind of those two tissues, they're together. Now the main function, so functions of mucous membrane, it actually has two. Oh. Absorption and secretion. Okay, absorption and secretion. You've heard those terms before. Now, let's talk about absorption and what is absorption. Where do I want to put this? Try something. I don't know. Can I change the color? I can highlight it maybe. No. It's okay. It'll just be boring. Absorption. Okay, let's talk about what absorption means. Okay, Remember, okay, the mucous membrane, it's going to line these body cavities, be lined in mucous membrane. It's for absorption. Now, we need to know what absorption means, and because we're going to be talking a lot about it. Now, absorption, let's think about just use the digestive tract for an example. And we eat breakfast. We eat breakfast, it makes its way to our digestive tract. We're going to break down that material, and then we're going to start absorbing those nutrients. We've talked about that before. We even talked about how those nutrients get into the blood system. So it has to cross the border. So physically, those nutrients have to go across the cells and get into the blood. So that technically is absorption. So absorption is the movement of substances into the blood or lymph. Okay, so we're getting it into those tissues, into those vessels. You know what secretion is. Creating a substance and moving it out of its cell. Oops. I don't know why it's doing that. I'll move that up. All right, so the mucous membrane, two major functions, absorption. So we're moving it across the border and getting it into the blood or the lymph. Secretion means the cells there are secreting a substance and moving that substance out of the cell. What that substance is, if it's a mucous membrane, I think you can figure this one out. Is mucus. Okay, mucus. My goodness. Blow it up a little bit more. All right, so mucus. I don't know. It's gonna go back. All right, we're just gonna go with it. So the mucous membrane secretes mucus. Think of mucus as a slime layer, okay? It has lots of functions, and we're going to talk about the functions of mucus, lots of different functions of mucus. Thinking of absorption and the mucous membrane. Have you ever heard of anything that was sublingual? Let me write this down. Sublingual. If we just look at the word, what does that word mean? Sublingual. Okay. I don't know what I'm doing here. It's crazy. Okay. Hold on. I know. For those of you who know how to work this, I'm probably driving you crazy. It would be me too. I don't know. All right, sublingual. So sub means underneath, lingual means the tongue. This would be like medicine that you would put under the tongue and then it would dissolve. And what happens is that because the mucous membrane functions in absorption, that substance can actually cross the border there in the mouth and get into the bloodstream. It can get into the vessels. So it can truly absorb some materials through the mucous membrane in different places. So even in the mouth. Things that come in sublingual forms, one that off the top of my head is B12. Maybe some of you have taken this before. You put it in your mouth, let it dissolve, and it will cross the border and get into the blood. It will be absorbed right there in the mouth. So B12 can cross the border there. There are some medications that can also do that as well. Have you ever heard of suppositories? Suppositories. You may or may not have heard of suppositories. And what suppositories are, they're usually medicine of some sort that get inserted up in the anus. And remember I said that cavities that open to the exterior are going to be lined in the mucous membrane. And so that works. There's a mucous membrane there. So if there's a reason why you can't swallow a pill or that medicine, an easier way to get it into the bloodstream would be as a suppository. So that's what that is. And it's relying on the mucous membrane for that absorption. Okay, so we've talked about two types of membranes, the cutaneous, which is the skin, we'll talk about that later, and then the mucous membrane. Let's move on to the third type, which is the serous membrane. Serous membrane. Older term, serosi. Okay. A little bit about this type of membrane. It is a wet membrane, and it is found in closed ventral body cavities. Okay, what does it do? Secretes serous fluid. The major function of serous fluid is lubrication. Now here is where it gets interesting. Each membrane, each serous membrane, is named for the location where it's found and the organ that it surrounds. So let me give you an example, a couple examples. There is a serous membrane that surrounds the heart, and the name of that membrane is called the pericardium. Okay, peri for surrounding, cardium, the heart. So this is the serous membrane that surrounds the heart. There is also one that surrounds the lungs, and we call that one the pleura. Oops. The pleura. All right, so the serous membrane found in closed ventral body cavities. So you think about the organs that it surrounds, like the heart and the lungs. Those are in closed ventral body cavities. And the pericardium surrounds the heart, and it produces serous fluid. And I said the function of the serous fluid was lubrication. So you might think, well, why does the heart need lubrication? Why in the world would it need lubrication? You have to think about where the heart is, and it's tucked into the lungs, right? So it's not kind of out by itself, but it's tucked into the lungs. And our organs, we sometimes visualize as being static structures, but they really aren't, especially not the heart and the lungs. They're always moving. So our heart is always filling with blood and getting bigger, and then contracting and squeezing that blood out and getting smaller. So it's getting larger and smaller. And what surrounds our heart are the lungs. And so if we think about that heart moving like this, getting bigger and smaller all the time, and the lungs right there, it has to slide past those lungs. If the serous membrane wasn't there to provide the serous fluid for lubrication, there would be a lot of friction between those organs. And friction, when it comes to organs, means it hurts. So if the pericardium gets swollen, it no longer produces the fluid, and then the friction increases and it gets very painful. And sometimes people think that they're having a heart attack. Pericarditis. Let me write that. Pericarditis, just looking at the term, just means inflammation of the pericardium. So pericarditis can be very painful. Same thing for the lungs. So the lungs have the pleura, surrounds in serous fluid, and the lungs are always moving, right? You take a deep breath, our lungs get really big. We exhale, and the lungs get smaller. And so it's surrounded in a pleura, and it produces that serous fluid, reduces that friction, but sometimes the pleura gets infected or inflamed, and we call that pleurisy. So pleurisy. So pleurisy is the condition in which the pleura is inflamed, and sometimes because of an infection, and it loses the ability to secrete the serous fluid, and it becomes very painful. Okay, we're going to move that up. We'll move it to the side. And talk about the last type of membrane, and that is the synovial membrane. Okay, where do we find synovial membranes? They line the cavities of joints. These are freely movable joints. Freely movable joints. And what do we call the free movable joints? Do we know? You learned this in lab. You call those synovial joints. So now you know why. Synovial joints. Give you some examples. The common names: hip, knee, elbow, shoulder. All right, I'm giving you locations of where we find those joints. Okay, synovial membrane. Okay, what does the synovial membrane do? It secretes synovial fluid into the joint cavity. What does the synovial fluid do? The synovial fluid, its major function is for lubrication. So synovial fluid function. It functions in lubrication and also nourishes. So it nourishes the joint cavity and the cartilage at the end of the bones, right? So where two bones come together, that is technically a joint. If it has that joint capsule, it has a synovial capsule, it's a synovial joint. Okay, if it's a synovial joint, it produces the synovial fluid, and the synovial fluid is very important. Two major functions. It provides for lubrication in that movable joint and also nourishes the structures there, which is the joint cavity and the cartilage at the end of the bones. Now, we also find synovial membranes. Oops. We also find synovial membranes lining bursa and tendon sheaths. Okay, those are around joints. All right, so that is all four of those membranes. And like I said, the cutaneous membrane, the one we didn't really talk about a whole lot, we will talk about when we jump into the integumentary system, okay, which is next. We're going to be starting the integumentary system.